If there was one film that I felt really dominated the last decade of film photography in terms of what people were shooting and the look that people were envisioning, it would be PORTRA 400 or Cinesto 800. But I got real mixed feelings on Cinesto. So many newcomers have taken an interest in film photography over the last decade, and they seem drawn in by this warm film with its nice fine grain and that instantly recognizable Kodak brand name on the side. And really, who can blame them? It's an incredible film and I love it, and it's what a lot of us who are younger and newer to film kind of expect film to look like now when we're shooting it. Colorful but not super saturated, some contrast but not to the extreme. It's warm and charming with a nice subtle grain that sort of eases younger enthusiasts into shooting film, especially if you've been spoon-fed digital all your life. Is it overhyped? Maybe, and that can definitely put people off if you're just seeing constant amounts of PORTRA 400 shots on social media. But it really is a very nice looking, very flexible film, and for good reason. It's part of Kodak's Pro lineup. Little bit of history here. The PORTRA lineup of films were introduced at the end of the 1990s for professional use. PORTRA is a portrait film, so it's meant to capture skin tones in a very pleasing, natural way. Kodak was producing PORTRA 160 and 400 in two different versions, VC and NC. VC stood for vivid color and was a more saturated color film, whereas NC was natural color, which is closer to the PORTRA that's available today. PORTRA 800 didn't exist until into the 2000s, and Kodak also introduced a 400 ISO black and white PORTRA C41 film, and a lineup of films called ULTRAColor, which sometimes had the PORTRA name on them. These were meant as an even more saturated film than vivid color. Most of that stuff was all discontinued by 2010, 2011. So what I'm saying is, there used to be a much wider variety of color film stocks out there, even within just the PORTRA lineup, but not anymore. In 2010, PORTRA 400 was updated by Kodak to improve grain and sharpness, and they also incorporated technology from their Vision motion picture films into PORTRA 400 for stills. PORTRA 400 is a very versatile color negative film stock that definitely lives up to that Kodak marketing of producing good skin tones and very fine grain. That 400 ISO appeals very easily to beginners as well because it allows for easier shooting in a variety of conditions over the lower ISO of PORTRA 160. I've always tended to prefer PORTRA 160 over the 400 stuff, but I think they're both equally solid film stocks. PORTRA 160 can feel warmer in comparison to 400 though. Reds and browns feel like they're a bit more enhanced on 160, while 400 keeps images a little more neutral. Because it's a pro film, it's meant to work in different situations and allow for a lot of versatility in the editing stage. I see a lot of people adopting this lower contrast pastel look when shooting PORTRA, and if you're new to shooting film and that's the look you're hoping for, then it's usually done with PORTRA. I personally feel that PORTRA 400 is a great film, and it deserves a lot of the attention that it gets, even though it is kind of everywhere, and that can be kind of exhausting sometimes. It's expensive though, so I don't pick it up a lot of the time. It looks good in 35, but I usually find myself picking up cheaper, more consumer kind of color stuff if I'm shooting color in 35. I think it definitely looks best when you step it up to medium format, and if you have a really nice camera, then this is probably what you're shooting anyways, so you don't necessarily need this recommendation. When we compare a pro film against a consumer one like Kodak's ULTRAMAX, which is also a 400 ISO film, the differences are most apparent in the grain, contrast, and saturation of the image. Consumer film is intended to give a pretty classic look without you needing to do much post-editing on a scan or a print. Gold, ULTRAMAX, and Pro Image definitely don't seem to draw as many people in as PORTRA does, but they're really good films that shouldn't be as overlooked as I think they are sometimes. PORTRA also comes in an 800 ISO option, which offers much of the same qualities as the lower ISO versions, but with that added bump in film speed that works well for lower light shooting. I also feel that PORTRA 800 tends to be a little more saturated in comparison to 400. 800 and 160 just don't have quite that level of natural looking colors in their results, whereas that's what people are drawn to for PORTRA 400. PORTRA 800 is also one of the very few remaining 800 ISO color options out there. Kodak's other pro color negative film is ECTAR, which only exists in a 100 ISO option. ECTAR is a more saturated film that's intended more for use with landscape photography and doesn't always give those flattering skin tone results like you get with PORTRA. Portra 160 and 800 are recommended primarily as a portrait film, but Kodak does say Portra 400 is suitable for nature and outdoor photography. I think Ektar is usually best for that, but Portra 400 is a higher ISO option in place of Ektar, and it's still going to give great results outdoors. So a lot of people have adopted it as just a casual walking around film, despite its price. Fujifilm was also producing a professional 400 film up until 2021. Pro 400H was very popular for wedding photographers, but the discontinuation of that stock has pushed even more people into using Portra 400 now, I think. I love Kodak's consumer stuff. Gold, Pro Image, COLOURPLUS, ULTRAMAX, they're a little punchier and a little less flexible and definitely have that kind of like family photo look of the past to them, but they're wonderful. And I think that diversity in the color film that people shoot is important in order to keep a variety of film stocks available. Last fall, in speaking with a manager at one of the biggest film labs in my city, they said that a Kodak rep spoke about how sometimes portrait demand is so big that it forces production on other things to take a back seat. This speaks to a variety of different things going on here. A lot of people are shooting film, which is awesome. A ton of people are buying Portra, which is good. It's possible that so much Portra is being made at times that it's impacting the option to adopt frequent use of some of the other Kodak films. And Kodak are in a constant struggle to manufacture enough film to meet the demand of this new age of film enthusiasm. I can't really talk about Portra now without touching on the discussion of film prices, film shortages, and the limited number of color film manufacturers in the world. We rely really heavily on Kodak if we want to shoot color film. They supply color film to Lomography, they supply color film to Cinestill, they're pretty spread out. Fujifilm paused the bulk of their film manufacturing a number of months ago due to the pandemic. That same pandemic is causing massive supply chain shortages in a number of industries, which is impacting Kodak's ability to meet the demand of people wanting to buy film. I mean, that and like the price of silver on a global scale has jumped 32% in the past 5 years, and that's a pretty big factor in film manufacturing. Portra is pretty expensive these days, and I really don't see that changing anytime soon. But the best we can kind of hope for is that some of this will result in Kodak slowly being able to set themselves up to better meet the demand in the future. We can also cross our fingers that another manufacturer will start being able to produce color photo film consistently and on a large scale in like the next decade. This month, ADOX launched their Color Mission 200 film, a limited amount of new color film that sale is aimed at funding more color film in the future. Kind of like a reverse crowdfunding, the opposite of what other film projects such as Farania and One Instant have done. So there are always possibilities. The price and availability and future of color film is a discussion that is too exhausting to think about constantly, but it's important to kind of have an understanding of what's going on. Portra is kind of everywhere in this community, on Instagram, on social media, subreddits, featured very heavily by larger YouTube channels, and it's not surprising to see beginners adopt it as like their go-to film. It's just really good to explore a variety of film stocks though, and exclusively shooting Portra is a very good way to make a very expensive hobby even more expensive. But Portra 400 really is such a great film, and so is Portra 160 and Portra 800 and Ektar as well. Portra will always be best for pictures of people, and Ektar will always kind of be best for pictures of places. But that's not really a rule that anybody needs to follow ultimately. It's good to have like a basic understanding of the film stocks that you're shooting, but in the end, just take pictures of what you want to take pictures of and don't let anybody else dictate that. Thank you so much for watching. There are links down in the description for if you want to support this channel through a Patreon or through merch if you're interested. There's also a P.O. Box address if you want to send something interesting or obscure of film-related stuff along to the channel for me to turn into a video. That is always insanely appreciated. And as always, I'll see you soon.